From Tortoise and Fora, this is The Review. Join Tortoise editors and special guests as they discuss the stories making the news headlines and the ones that should be. Switch up your podcasts, newsletters and magazines and take part in a live editorial meeting like no other. Book your free ticket for The Review every Thursday at Fora Soho.
NBC به نقل از 4 منبع از گفتگوی غیر مستقیم ایران آمریکا
Let him know that we know where he lives, we know the way that he goes to his office, and London is a very dark city in the middle of night.
I'm Paul Caruana Galizia. Iran trying to assassinate people in Britain isn't a story that I thought I'd ever cover.
The counter-terrorism police told me that I had to inform my children's school about the threats.
When reporting my last podcast series, Londongrad, an investigation into Russian money in London, I began to see the city in a completely different light.
And that is the moment I realized, okay, my life in London that I used to think was safe is no longer the same.
He said that counter-terrorism police officers working with the security service, so MI5, intercepted 5 assassination or abduction plots since November 2022.
It doesn't surprise me at all, and clearly your number of escalation from 10 to 15, that is what the DG of MI5 is revealing publicly. I would, if anything, suggest that's quite a low number.
This story isn't only about freedom of the press, and it isn't just about Iran. It's about Britain and who the country protects and why. From Tortoise, this is Series 2 of Londongrad, Iran's hit squads.
From Tortoise and Fora, this is The Review. Join Tortoise editors and special guests as they discuss the stories making the news headlines and the ones that should be. Switch up your podcasts, newsletters and magazines and take part in a live editorial meeting like no other. Book your free ticket for The Review every Thursday at Fora Soho.
Okay, afternoon everyone. Thanks for joining for another ThinkIn. For those who don't know me, I'm Kat Neelan. I'm the political editor here at Tortoise. And today we are going to be talking about what do the Tories do now, which sort of seems like a fairly simple question, but I think has been dividing them, and we kind of have to go along for the ride until they've figured it out. So obviously, the Conservatives have gone through a huge period of turmoil. We're on our third Prime Minister in a year. We've had a sort of kind of across the sort of gamut of views on what we should do in terms of the economy, what we should do in terms of sort of social sort of philosophy. And now it kind of feels as though even before they are out of power, Conservative MPs and thinkers are already trying to sort of plan what they should be doing next. But actually, I think the bigger question, and the reason why we're saying this, is because it's what they should do now that's important. And I will sort of talk a bit more about some polling that for an event I went to this morning that shows that actually there is still a world in which there could be a hung parliament, and so it's not necessarily the case that Labour is going to be the next government. So the polling has been fairly consistent. Labour has had a strong, healthy double-digit lead, and the sort of moment that kind of crossed over was actually December 2021, when the Owen Paterson scandal happened. I don't know if you guys remember that, but it was around unpaid lobbying. He was found to have sort of engaged in unpaid lobbying and was supposed to be suspended. Boris Johnson then tried to circumvent that, and it caused a huge row internally. And then not long after that was kind of the start of the Partygate saga, which then ran for several months. There was a vote of no confidence, which Boris Johnson actually won. Partygate didn't end, but the thing that ultimately did for him was the Chris Pincher affair, which, again, we're still sort of seeing this kind of issue around sexual misconduct play out in Westminster throughout all the parties, but there does seem to be a lot of Conservative MPs that applies to. After Boris, we had the first leadership contest where we saw, I think, some of the names that could become future leader contenders. People like Suella Braverman, Kemi Badenoch, Penny Mordaunt, and of course Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. And we kind of all know how that ended. And then we ended up with our third Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who has been sort of trying to rebuild things, stabilise things, give off this kind of air of a sort of quiet competence, and along with his Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, who is very much in the same kind of mould, sort of I was just chatting to some of my colleagues outside, trying to get the economy, which is the kind of real focus of their work, trying to get that back into as good a place as it can be ahead of the next election. And so the election is kind of, being pushed back to the latest possible moment in order to allow the economy time to rebuild as much as possible. Now, John Curtis, who is a very well-respected pollster, psephologist, has said that there has never been an instance where a government has presided over a financial crisis and then gone on to win the next election. So this is kind of where the sort of thinking is, that it's all baked in. Rishi Sunak will effectively bow out at the next election, and it's just a case of sort of damage limitation. But a lot of Conservative MPs do sort of point to the fact that Labour's lead in the poll is very soft, and this is kind of borne out again by some of the findings of this poll that I was briefed on this morning. That there is not a huge sort of passionate movement behind Keir Starmer. But neither is there a huge passionate movement behind Rishi Sunak. And so a couple of month ago, I went to 2 different conferences about the future of conservatism, although they weren't necessarily billed as that. One was called the Conservative Democratic Organisation, which is funded by Lord Cruddas, Peter Cruddas, who is a huge Boris fan, and many of the speakers, and I would say all of the delegates, were Boris fans. So he's the kind of we can't quit you type component of the Conservative Party. There is I would say it's a minority, but it's a fairly significant minority of Conservative members and some MPs who still very much believe that Boris Johnson is the solution to the problems. And then later that same week, I went to the NatCon conference, which was very, very different in tone. So the CDO conference felt like your typical British political get-together. It was at a seaside town. It was in Bournemouth. It was a small sort of group of politically interested party members who were not hugely diverse, either in ethnicity or age or financial background or any of the sort of metrics that you might want to judge diversity by. The NatCon conference was held in a church, which I think is quite telling. There were distinct religious overtones to the whole thing. And of course, it was organised by an American think tank. And so that felt very much to me like an attempt at trying to import American-style conservatism to the UK, which I don't really think will succeed. I think that as a nation, we are quite used to having a sort of distinction between our sort of personal and social beliefs, religious or otherwise, and the sort of political sphere. And it felt like it was trying to do something that I don't think will get a huge amount of momentum behind it here. Yes.
Just on the NatCon one.
Yeah.
Is it? So are you saying it's less of a shop window for kind of what the Conservative Party stands for, or is it people trying to influence what the Conservative Party should stand for? I'm trying to work out like what the...
Yeah, it felt like they were trying to make it happen.
Right.
And obviously they did have some big name speakers, Suella Braverman and Michael Gove. I get the impression from speaking to members of Gove's team that perhaps in hindsight they you know, I mean, they were perfectly happy with what he said. He said what he believes in, but I don't necessarily know whether they would do that again. Whereas Suella's speech felt very much like a kind of pitch for leadership, and I think she would probably be quite happy doing that again. And the more interesting speeches actually came from MPs who are less well known. Danny Kruger, who might be more well known as the son of Prue Leith, and Miriam Cates, who both talked about sort of socially conservative family values type things, you know, the quote normative family and sort of socially conservative issues, which then when I was speaking to Conservative MPs, even those on the right of the party, were saying that just doesn't wash anymore, primarily because we will end up looking like hypocrites. I think the exact quote was, you can guarantee that if you start talking about family values the week after, someone will be caught with their trousers down. So, you know, there is a sort of scepticism as to whether that's the right approach, because they know that their house is not completely in order, but also because I just don't think that that's what a majority of the population want. And so I'm just going to turn to some of the polling from this morning, which was MRP. I'm not going to tell you what that stands for because I can't remember, but it's the sort of new-ish, fangled way of polling that has been much more accurate than some of the kind of more traditional polling, and correctly called the more recent elections, including, I think, what someone was saying this morning, they estimated that the Conservatives would end up with an 81-seat majority in 2019, and they ended up with an 80-seat majority. So it's pretty accurate. And they are saying here, now they've got a sort of range of possible outcomes. The sort of, as far as Labour is concerned, the best case scenario would be that they could win 470 seats, which would be a huge landslide. That's a 140-seat majority. But there are a few things that might affect that. So one of them is if Reform, which is currently led by Richard Tice, but Nigel Farage has talked about making a comeback, if they stand aside, that could actually whittle down Labour's lead to 401 and give the Conservatives 201 seats. So already you can see kind of a shift there. And then when you kind of allow for a sort of overlay of demographics, it actually could end up in a hung parliament. So Labour with 316 seats and the Conservatives with 286 seats. And the phrase that they kept using was that Labour is currently winning by default because people are angry or annoyed with the Conservatives. And in Scotland, there is a sort of post-Sturgeon factor. People feel very... I think they were saying that it's almost like a loss, like a, you know, they've lost this person a leader that they really believed in, and so Labour is sort of winning by default. But actually, in the sort of next year to 18 months of campaigning, and if the economy does improve, then there will be sort of more reasons for people to vote for the Conservatives. So it is a soft leadership. It is a soft lead, sorry. And I just wanted to sort of pick up on some of the kind of slightly interesting comments that they made. This was from focus groups. They described Rishi Sunak as Little Rishi, which made me laugh. He is taller than me, but, you know, let's not judge. But also described Keir Starmer as being a bit meh. And the other thing which I used to run some focus groups myself, and I also picked up on, is this idea that Keir Starmer is somehow part of the aristocracy because he's a Sir, and therefore he's not really one of us, which is kind of what Boris Johnson was trying to do a lot by calling him Sir Keir all the time, and you can see Rishi doing that with Sir Softy and so on. So they're sort of, obviously they are fully aware of Labour's weaknesses and are pushing them. So John Curtis described Sunak, Starmer and Ed Davey, who is the leader of the Liberal Democrats, as, he said, "We are in a peculiar moment where none of the three political leaders are seemingly capable of articulating a vision of the country they want to create by 2030, and said that creates a vacuum for Boris Johnson to come back. And so, again, I think that this is a period in which, because we don't have someone who is out there saying, vote for me, this is what I will do, I will change this, I will make this better for you, that people are, there's no kind of strong conviction behind any one of the parties at the minute, or any one of the leaders. Luke Trill from More in Common, he said that the party who will win is the one that can best convince people they can switch on the 6 o'clock news and not be scared, because people are so exhausted by the news and so sort of fed up, and this idea that everything is broken is so sort of prevalent. Now, we know... Oh, and actually another good quote from Luke Trill in terms of after Rishi Sunak, assuming they do lose, is about which leader they would pick. And a lot of focus has obviously been on Suella Braverman. But he says, in terms of the focus group responses, she would be, quote, the longest suicide note in history. Because she's so polarising, whereas Penny Mordaunt and Kemi Badenoch both test well in focus groups because they're seen as authentic. And obviously Penny Mordaunt had a bit of a bounce after the coronation because she was holding the sword. Well, I mean, look, has anyone here held a sword for 2 hours? I haven't. Kemi Badenoch, I mean, they are both Brexiteers, which I think is quite interesting that is still something that the Conservatives would look for in a leader. But Kemi Badenoch has annoyed the ERG quite a lot with her sort of quite high-handed way of responding to them about the retained EU bill. But as people who have listened to the ERG podcast will know, they are not quite the force that they once were. So Rishi Sunak has these 5 pledges, and they are to halve inflation. I've forgotten what they are now. That's good. Halve inflation, grow the economy, stop the boats, and I'll find the others. But even on those 3, it's now looking increasingly... When he first set those pledges out, the view was, well, they're very easy. You know, grow the economy, didn't even put a figure on it. It was just to grow it a bit. Halve inflation, everyone thought, well, that's, it will just halve. The economy can't keep, inflation can't keep growing at this rate. It will halve anyway. And I think that's what the sort of IMF/Bank of England had been forecasting. Debt falling, cut the NHS waiting lists and stop small boats, or pass new laws to stop small boats. But increasingly, the view is that he won't achieve any of these, and that will be a real problem for him. And I think this kind of then comes back to what will Conservative MPs do. It all kicked off again last week when the story broke about the Cabinet Office passing on the details of from Boris Johnson's diaries of potentially lockdown-breaking parties that took place in Chequers. That went down very badly with Boris supporters, not unsurprisingly, who immediately started talking about letters of no confidence going in, and, it could be the thing that kind of upends Rishi Sunak's leadership. So the fact is that he is walking on eggshells with his party. He knows that the support for him is very shallow, whereas the support for Boris Johnson, although is narrow, is very deep. So those who do like Boris Johnson will die for him, and those who do like Rishi Sunak might not cross the road for him.
So, question about Boris and his depth and narrowness of his support. You're saying that Curtis said this morning that there's an opening for him. If let's just suppose that there was another Tory eruption and they changed leader before. The suggestion is that this is a vacuum that he might use before the next election, right? Does that, and that might galvanise his base. That would galvanise his base within the party, but would it not also galvanise non-Tory voters against the Tories and widen the national gap that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that it's even something that people ask about shows how bad things are for the party, that they don't have, that they haven't put this to bed. And, you do still get people saying, well, he could come back. They say the wider public don't really care. And that is kind of borne out by some polling, because people don't pay as much attention to what's happening as people that are political obsessives. I think that probably it is incredibly unlikely that they would change at this stage.
But there is a logic to changing the leader, isn't there? Because they're looking at losing under Sunak, so why not change? Yeah. Why not try something else? And they happen to have an election winner in the shadows. Go on.
I mean, I think they're looking at losing under anybody. That's why the question is interesting, because I think there's no plausible scenario where even they, I think, the ones I talk to, think they can win the next election. Because the economic track record is terrible. Inflation is really, really stubborn. That's a problem from that sense of brokenness. There's a real weight around their neck. So I don't think even the most optimistic Conservatives think they're going to win this thing. And that's the frame for the decision they're going to take. And so so they're looking to recovery, repair, a future beyond the next election. And in that, I'm not sure that Boris features in that. Boris is arguably a short-term card you'd play if you were mad enough to think you can win the next election. But if you're interested beyond that, you're not going to go there, are you?
I think Boris is probably a card you play to kind of force Rishi to do things rather than something that is a serious possibility. And I mean, we've talked before about. I don't even think he's actually going to stand. I mean, increasingly, this is the view from people that I speak to, is that it's not a case of will he stand in Uxbridge or will he stand in Henley. Increasingly, people are of the view he's not going to stand at all. Now, I think he is, as many of them are, a sort of pragmatist that will hold off making that decision until the absolute latest minute. To the point about most of them thinking they are going to lose, I think you can look and see how many of them have said they're going to stand down as a kind of indication of the fact that they see the writing is on the wall. But that said, Starmer is not Blair, and the momentum behind him is not 97 New Labour style. The majority that the Conservatives have at the minute is such that even with a huge swing, you could still end up in a territory where it is a hung parliament or a very small majority, in which case, as you say, it is about how long are they in opposition. Is it a couple of years and then it collapses? Is it 5 years? Is it 2 terms? These are all kind of decisions that or sort of possibilities that they are sort of wargaming. And I think a lot will depend on who they pick as their post-Rishi leader as to how long they'll spend in the wilderness. Yeah.
Just on that sort of question of like how long they sort of stay in opposition, what is the general mood that sort of, they're resigned to it, but maybe it's a good thing they feel they can get their house in order and sort of be back before 2030, or are a lot of them terrified that if they lose, the party will tear themselves apart, and they're sort of looking down the barrel of, which is why so many of them are sort of standing down, maybe.
Well, there's no real consensus, and this is the problem, right? There is no one sort of Conservative MP that kind of speaks for the whole party, because you've got the red wallers, you've got the blue wallers, you've got people that have been there for a while, you've got people who are just starting. And so there is kind of confusion and a huge disagreement about what direction they should go in. I think that, you know, the sort of Trussites are sort of making a sort of big shout about the need to cut taxes. But I don't think that they are sort of a serious proposition in terms of the internal politics. I think that, you know, you can tell by the fact that Rishi Sunak has kept Suella Braverman on for as long as he has done, albeit, you know, apparently not with any great enthusiasm, that he sees that the sort of immigration issue is kind of a big one. So if they sort of pivot more towards that in the post-Rishi era, you could, I think it will sort of send the party in one of two ways, right? Either they will have to lean, they cannot, sorry, let me get my words straight. The 2019 election result created a very, very unusual coalition of voters, coalition of Conservative voters. You would not normally expect to have the sort of socially conservative but economically kind of left-wing red wall voters in the same party as the socially liberal but small state voters of the sort of, you know, the typical Tory core. And I don't think there's any hope of maintaining either of those. In fact, I think it's probably quite likely they will lose significant support from both of those. The question is, do you try and appeal to, which one do you try to appeal to? Rishi Sunak would sort of seem to naturally lend himself more towards the sort of blue wall. But the scrap will be over whether they go red wall or go blue wall, I think, ultimately. And I think, you know, if you see a world in which people are sort of saying, well, it could be Suella, Kemi, maybe Penny Mordaunt versus, say, James Cleverly, then, you know, what is interesting is that because the One Nations haven't really spoken up very much, the One Nations are the sort of moderate centrist, they are not talking about their vision for the future of the party because their guy is the Prime Minister. So what we're hearing is the sort of fighting on the right and the sort of scrapping for the future of the party on the right. We're not hearing anyone articulate the future of the party on the left. And so that is a bit of a vacuum, and it makes it seem as though it's more likely that the Conservatives will lurch to the right, but I don't think that's necessarily the case.
You think the membership will just take them to the right? Because there's not a left-wing view. Yeah, the problem with Luke Trill's view in the focus groups is that it doesn't take any account of who's going to vote in. And actually, the membership are going to be a lot keener on Suella Braverman than Luke Trill in his focus groups.
And the problem is, I guess, it's the sort of Corbyn dilemma, right? If you allow yourself to be kind of co-opted by the members, well, actually, the vast majority of voters of any persuasion do not think like the members of any persuasion. You know, they're always more extreme. They're more extreme than MPs, and they're more extreme than voters. So, I mean, if the members sort of dictate who the leader will be, which seems likely, unless you just manage to get into a two-horse race, for, you know, then we could be in a sort of period where they are out of, the Conservatives are in opposition for a long time because, you know, they will just be beyond the pale for most people.
So I'm just obviously I've got memories of 2016 slightly, I guess, but how much, and something you noted from the conferences was this kind of American kind of slide, at least, and not just on culture war and kind of the religious front and those kind of arguments, and how much those kind of events running in Camden, we're going to have Trump being indicted while he's running in primaries, and whether or not they're going to be looking that side and going, can we learn something here in terms of how we move? Is that something that is happening, or in Europe as well? Is there kind of other patterns that we can associate outside of the UK?
I mean, I think they're all quite distinct, but it's probably more a function of voters feeling that they're not being listened to, and economic problems that kind of result in a sort of protest vote of some kind. But, immigration had really dropped off the list of salient issues until Suella Braverman started talking about the invasion of immigrants. And so actually, most people were more worried about NHS, public services, being able to get to work, being able to pay the bills, and all of a sudden this issue kind of popped up, and then it kind of surges for a bit. I think the view from within the party is that she has created a headache for them because they're not going to be able to solve that, Yeah. I mean, it's taken successive governments however many years, and it's a bit of a whack-a-mole, isn't it? Because you stop immigrants getting the lorries, and then they're getting small boats, and then, and now this is a huge, huge problem with sort of miles of coastline and kind of, how do they solve it? It's going to be a very difficult one for them to. Build a wall. You cannot just build a wall. So I think that in terms of sort of immigration as an issue, it's not. From speaking to sort of MPs and speaking to sort of pollsters and focus groups, people and things like that, it's not the issue that people had or have front of mind. Mm-hmm. The issue that people are worried about right now is the economy. And so, when interest rates are still going up, inflation is still going up, and there is sort of uncertainty in the market, that will sort of take precedence. The way that then immigration could become an issue is things like housing and services and so on and so forth. If people start to see that kind of having a real world impact on their lives, but it hadn't been.
So, first of all, thank you for doing that 25-minute uninterrupted bit at the beginning where you rattle through. No, because it was interesting, because it made me think there are so many things that keep happening, like weird incidences, bits of scandal, bits of, corruption, whatever. And if we're thinking about the stories behind the story and sort of avoiding some of the noise, what do you think are some of the things that either Tortoise or generally have over-reported on, and are there things that have been under-reported on that need further investigation? Like, were there incidents that were kind of glossed over, or were there things that were kind of made too much of just because, I don't know, it might have been a quiet news week or something? Or are there things that deserve going back and revisiting now the dust has settled a bit? Because it's just like a never-ending catalogue of bizarre incidents, basically, for the last 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think journalists in general focus on the people rather than the policies, and I think that's the problem, is that we spend far more time talking about Boris Johnson than we do about what he maybe was trying to do with levelling up, or housing, or the NHS, and so on and so forth. So I think probably we all need to sort of think about what do people really care about, and not to be sort of caught up in the circus. And it's really difficult because that's exciting and interesting, and the personalities are quite fun at times. And it has been a particularly crazy period where the personalities have mattered because they have dictated things, like Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. Their personal view of the world has had a real world impact on everyone's finances. You can't always separate the two, but I think we need to sort of be able to drill down into what's actually going on. And also I think probably, and this will naturally happen now that Labour is more of a viable prospect as the future government, is to really interrogate what they're doing and how different it is. when it comes to their suggestions for the future.
But is there a thing that you think actually we should probably go back and have a look at that? Or I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Well, you know, I think housing is the sort of defining issue of our time, because it is the thing that Tory strategists worry about. Like, they know that the the fact that people are getting older before they become homeowners will have a real existential bearing on their party. And of course, you know, we all, you know people who, if you're renting, your rent has gone up astronomically in the last year or so because you don't have any control over that. And interest rates mean that mortgage owners, they're paying more. So it's that kind of really sort of tangible thing for most people. But it's something which, again, doesn't seem to have had any kind of real sort of interrogation and kind of proper solutions coming out of it. And partly that is because the party and the country are divided on whether we should be building more or whether we should be protecting spaces. So I think that, but then also, you know, I think the sort of post-Brexit, what is Britain doing? Like, we can't have a sort of vibrant economy without having good sort of industry sectors, exports and so on. So I think, you know, where is the sort of big picture, sort of 20-year thinking coming from in terms of making the UK a vibrant country again?
This is The Economist. So I have a Scotland question. How many, imagine a 10 to 14 point spread on election day, or maybe a bit softer, 8 to 14 point. How many seats does Labour have to take off the SNP to get an overall majority? That's question one.
Bloody hell,
No, but isn't that... I was hearing that unless there's a seismic change in the apportionment of seats in Scotland, then despite this big poll lead, Labour's still looking, as you say, at a plurality, but not an overall majority.
Yeah, Scotland is definitely the probably the key battleground. So at the minute they've got 1 MP, I think, yeah. And the Tories have got 6. So it's a very low base, and you would expect them to go up quite significantly from that. I think Anna Sawar has been making some sort of good, gaining some ground. But again, he's not a hugely inspirational person. And, you know, in Scotland, you know, regardless of your personal views of them, Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon were both very inspiring, charismatic individuals. So that there is a kind of a problem at the minute in Scotland, as in England, where, you know, you've kind of lost some of the sort of sparky individuals that people will really rally behind. And I do think you could probably see a sort of lower turnout electorally because people are fed up with it all and just have no positive reason to vote. But I think they're sort of estimating around 31 seats in Scotland for Labour at the minute. So
that's like 2/3, right?
Yeah.
Or 3/5.
Yeah.
Wow.
But that's huge. So Labour, Conservative Labour people think they'll win 15 in Scotland. 31 would be a real triumph for them, wouldn't it? Because you're right, Charles. Without Scotland to get an overall majority, the Labour has to win Jacob Rees-Mogg's seat to win in England alone. So that does look like a really uphill thing. I guess the question is whether the mood in Scotland lasts for the next year and a half.
Yeah.
Or whether it's, you know, being driven by...
Which will probably be more sort of caused by what happens with the SNP rather than necessarily what happens with Labour or Conservatives. But I think, you know, obviously if you're an ex-SNP voter, I mean, there's nothing to say you couldn't then go to the Greens, for argument's sake, because some of these smaller pro-independence parties are sort of gaining more ground. So it's not necessarily that Labour will pick up all of these seats, but maybe that's the best case scenario is 31. But that's sort of, yeah, obviously they're kind of hoping, and I think we would see Starmer's been up there quite a bit already. I would expect to see him really kind of going hard in that particular area.
Speaking of Starmer, are we allowed to talk about Labour briefly, even though this is all about the Tories?
Yeah.
To your point about policy versus personalities, Starmer is boring.
Yeah.
Rachel Reeves is boring snoring, officially, right? Yeah. She's not kicked that. Sunak is boring.
Yeah.
So this is going to be a boring election from a personality point of view. Mm. Does that mean that it might be an interesting election from a policy point of view? And is that, in fact, what Starmer is counting on, that he will, not that he's really done it yet, but lay out, make the electorate an offer it can't refuse in policy terms?
I think probably, it feels to me like all the leaders at the minute are kind of placeholders. And we will, see a sort of next generation kind of come up behind them. So the kind of on Labour's side, Wes Streeting, I know that Andy Burnham isn't in Westminster, but he carries a lot of sway, and could he kind of help to bolster it? So it may be more of a sort of team sport rather than a kind of leader. And as already discussed with the Conservatives, you've got, the kind of next guard already sort of very much kind of fighting for it.
Who are they?
Suella Braverman, Kemi Badenoch, Penny Mordaunt, etc., James Cleverly. So I think we will always find ourselves more willing to write about the personalities rather than the policies. Policies are kind of boring in and of themselves unless you get something that you feel is going to make a real clear difference. And
unless we underestimate the voters. I mean, we've had a bellyful of personalities. This is why what you say about housing, maybe that's the kind of thing that actually in the end is going to decide the next election.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know, maybe I kind of find things like the sort of green energy policy quite boring. I can't get that excited about a lot of the things that are kind of, I think probably are important, but they're not dial-changing policies. I'm yet to see anything that I've thought, wow, that's a real moment. And look, I'm a part of the electorate just as much as I'm a reporter. So I think that, when you look at the sort of real sort of paradigm shifts in politics, whether it's sort of yes we can, or things can only get better, or get Brexit done, its message is always boiled down into something very simple, and it's about change in some way. And it's usually change for a positive thing. I mean, you can kind of have a personal dislike of Brexit, but for people who believed in Brexit, that was positive, right? So there is no sort of what you would call like a retail offer that can be distilled into something really simple for people. Like the Corbyn manifesto was so over the top, like really, really too long. People can't digest that much. You need to have something that's simple that they can kind of take away and kind of think, I know what this guy stands for, or woman would be nice. I know what this person stands for, and I will sort of, put my faith in them to be able to deliver it. And it doesn't feel like that at the minute.
Can I rebut you only slightly in that I think the moment I was like, oh, I can see this being one of the games for the next election is childcare, because that was something that was not really in the sphere of, it was kind of sitting with campaigners like Jodie Brearley, and then suddenly it's in the budget, and then they kind of hop-stepped Labour's own policy, which means that Labour's going to have to go further. And that was the only point I went, it's still not good enough. There's still some issues in universal credit. It's still not great policy, but it is much better in many ways. I mean, you can better talk to that than me. But,
unfortunately, I won't be benefiting from it because it's not coming in. But anyway,
but it was long term, and it felt like something. Is that a wrong idea about policies like that are?
No, and the problem that Labour does have is that whenever it does articulate clear new policies, then the Conservatives come along and nab that idea. So you kind of, they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. And I think you're right. I think childcare was shaping up to be a big battleground, but that seems to have been slightly neutered by the budget.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's never been a high salience issue, even though you could argue it should be. It's never been in the top 10 of things that people vote on.
But then have I made up Stevenage women or someone?
No, Stevenage women is a thing. Yeah.
Stevenage women who
Yes.
would that then fit like childcare into that?
So every kind of electoral cycle we get these kind of Mondeo man, Workington man, and this time around it's Stevenage woman, which for those of you who haven't seen it, is someone that basically isn't that interested in politics, wants their kids to do well and have more money, so it's basically like everyone. But the reason why they've sort of pinpointed Stevenage is because that is it's one of those seats that is sort of defines the government. So if it's Tory, then it will be a Tory government. If it's Labour, it will be a Labour government. And it is quite far down the list of seats. The MP there, although he's standing down, he says, you might question whether this is true given that he's standing down, but he says he's confident that the Conservatives will keep it because it's sort of 400th or something on the list of marginal seats. But anyway, it's always useful for strategists to kind of have an archetype voter that they're after, and I think it is interesting that they are going after a woman this time.
Yeah, that was why I thought it was interesting.
Anyone else?
Yeah, one more. I'm sorry, you can't. Sorry. From the C word to the L word to the E word, Europe.
Yes.
Okay, so not the B word, but last week Sunak went to Chisinau, Moldova.
Yes.
European political community. Macron's project, second meeting, an outer circle, political rather than economic, outside the EU. When you talk to centrist Tories, or do they attach any significance at all to this as a project that they can talk about without sacrificing their reputations and their seats? And is it a glimmer of a way back into Europe? Or is it poisoned by association with Macron?
I think, not by Macron, but just by the whole Brexit thing. I think people still feel shell shock from...
Yeah, but, right, everybody... So Truss was right. We need growth, right? And it's freaking obvious where we're going to get growth from. So someone has got to find a way to talk about this.
So I think basically, yes. There is obviously, and I think probably it will be more so after the next election, because a lot of the MPs that we have in at the minute are sort of a time in which Brexit was very salient. I think after the next election, I think that's dying down. And I think after the next election, we will have more people for whom Brexit either is not a priority or they really are more sort of remain/rejoin. I think that people are scared to put their heads above the parapet on that because so many people have been shot down by it. But going back to this morning's briefing with John Curtis, he was talking about how the sort of importance of it has changed and also kind of what it's doing to the sort of political allegiances. So he said basically if you were a Labour Remainer, you are still a Labour Remainer. If you were a Tory Remainer, you might be a bit sort of wobbly. If you were a Tory Leaver, you've probably it's less important, or B, you may have even changed your mind about whether you thought that leave was a good thing. So let me get my figures. So he was saying that currently polls now have 57% of people saying they want to rejoin, and the loyalty to Remain/Leave, if you were a Remainer of any stripe, 82% of people still who were Remainers are still Remainers, whereas 74% of people who were Leavers continue to be Leavers. So actually, you are starting to see a shift, and that doesn't allow for the number of people that are now able to vote who weren't in 2016. So that will also be sort of, there's a demographic trend that will, at some point, push towards rejoin. It is obviously stronger with Labour than it is with the Conservatives. I don't think that's going to happen in this election, but I think it will be. I think people will feel more comfortable about being open about it by the next election.
I still think you're going to have to invest in a packet of Rennies, because you're going to get an ulcer if you carry on like that. Because no one's going to talk about this in this election. Because this is our first proper post-Brexit election, isn't it? And people, Starmer's not going to talk about it, the Tories aren't.
Can you recommend a over-the-counter?
I can help you out.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Did you identify who that guy was?
Which guy?
Will you send a picture or no?
Oh yeah, that was Gene Simmons is in the Commons. So there you go, watching PMQs. Rebecca?
No one is talking, no political party has got anything to offer young people. Is that because they're going to vote the way they're going to vote, or because we have no hope?
There is a Labour student policy.
I'm not a student. I don't care about students.
I think this is one of the problems that Labour has, is that they're still sort of trying to win back the voters that they lost in 2019, and so there is a sense to which the sort of lefty liberal urban people, where else are they going to go? Yeah. So they don't need to try and win them over. The focus is on people who live in towns, particularly in the north. That's where you win, basically.
From the Greens is not all sort of the third Lib Dem way, because if you're young, you're going to pull whatever colour the anti-Tory lever is, and in most cases that's Labour.
Yeah, and Lib Dems are anti-building as well. So if you want to get on the housing ladder, you wouldn't go for them. Again, the Greens and Lib Dems always do well in local elections, or better in local elections, but that's because there's sort of an opportunity for people to say, look, I'm not terribly happy with the two main parties, but when push comes to shove, as you say, if you're motivated more by who you don't want to get in than by who you do, then you just go for one of the two big ones. Yeah.
Is it, thinking through where does Labour go to important issues like environment, NHS, housing, but doesn't get people excited, do the Tories probably lurch towards kind of the really nasty issues, or the nasty party of immigration, culture war, the things that do get their voters excited? And does that, to end on a slightly pessimistic note, give us a really divisive and nasty politics in the months ahead?
Yeah, I am a sort of an inner optimist, so I always hope that it's not going to go down that route. But I think a lot will kind of depend on, well, who are the sort of real players within the party after the election. So Suella Braverman is kind of propped up by a group called the Common Sense Group, which is led by a guy called John Hayes, but also has people like Bill Cash sort of working with her. But they are old white men of a certain vintage and a certain worldview. And whenever I sort of talk about Suella and John Hayes to other Conservative MPs, they kind of laugh, because they're just like, who are they? You know, John Hayes, they kind of say, is nobody. Suella's support is so overblown. She really doesn't have the backing of the party. So I think that, I hate making predictions, but I think that probably the flirtation with the sort of culture wars and the sort of anti-immigration rhetoric might be kind of coming to an end. I wouldn't say it was definitely over, but I think they probably recognise, if they want to be in power, that's not the way to do it. It might be a few years before they kind of completely get over that addiction.
And a very, very slight related follow-up, but on the people side, Ruth Davidson, is that a secret kind of campaign weapon for Rishi Sunak in Scotland? Maybe brings him back towards the blue wall as well in England?
I mean, she's the greatest Tory, a Scottish Tory that there has ever been. You know, she was a real loss. Douglas Ross is just, you know, can't hold a candle to her. So if she were to come back and kind of campaign for them, then I think they would be very, very pleased. I don't know that she's planning to do that. I mean, she's got a media career in London now, so, you know, I don't know. And she's got a young family, which is the reason why she quit in the first place. So, but, you know, I think she found the whole Boris Brexit era quite difficult. You know, a lot of particularly women, but a lot of sort of centrist Conservatives found that whole period really unpalatable. Lots of death threats, lots of kind of, you know, the whole Surrender Act and all of that kind of nasty rhetoric around people, sort of the you know, the enemies of the people. So perhaps with sort of the adults in charge, she might be tempted back potentially. But you know, Labour probably wouldn't want that, because you wouldn't want to campaign alongside the Conservatives as a kind of pro-union force, because, you know, they're still quite... Without Boris, the Conservatives have more of a chance in Scotland than they did, but there's still a big sort of anti-Conservative feeling, I think, in Scotland. Anyone else? Flags up. Okay. All right. Thanks ever so much, everyone.